Hi everyone, and welcome to the Risk Awareness Week. Today we have an amazing session with Warren Black, and I've met Warren online quite a few years ago when he introduced a wonderfully interesting and new at the time concept of complexity management to risk management, and he started challenging a lot of the kind of conventional, ISO 31000 COSO thinking, saying that that is just not good enough in the world that is so volatile and ever changing. And he was right. With the coronavirus, as we see, a lot of the traditional risk management really just did not fit well. But let me introduce quickly Warren, and let Warren kind of introduce himself, and we will have this very timely discussion around complexity risk management and coronavirus and the lessons we can take away from the current situation for our profession and for our lives in general. And just keep in mind that we want to keep the session as interactive as possible. Ask questions, write comments, talk to each other as the participants in the comments below this video, and you can always find Warren's contact on the right side of the video as well. So Warren, over to you. Tell us a little bit about your background, how you got to that specific area within kind of risk profession at the moment, and set up this little conversation for us.
Yeah. Thank you, Alex. Thank you for inviting me to this forum, and thank you for actually setting something like this up. I'm always encouraged by these kind of forums that promote new thinking and more advanced thinking in the area of risk. I am, I guess, by trade a risk engineer. I've worked most of my career in infrastructure project environments. That's where I currently work. And one of the things I noticed working in the project environment is that projects were just getting more and more complex every year. And I started getting this gut feeling that conventional risk methods weren't suited for environments of advanced complexity. So I started working with the Queensland University of Technology's engineering and science faculty. And eventually we came up with a research project, which I call the Complexus Research Project, which is essentially a PhD research project. And we're exploring how complexity influences risk, and more importantly, how risk management techniques, methods, and understanding and even thinking needs to evolve to start considering some of the phenomena that come out of highly complex situations. And this led me on to various areas of interest. And one of the more recent ones has obviously become the coronavirus. As you'll know, for years I've been talking about that we have to upskill to understand how to manage risks in highly complex, highly dynamic environments. And this year, as tragic as it has been, it's actually been a phenomenal case study for how complexity influences risk and what I would call the next generation of risk management and risk thinking. And that's what I was encouraged to talk to you about. I've been running a blog, which you know, which has looked at a number of aspects of the coronavirus. And I've just put a couple of observations that I think are interesting and worth talking about into a presentation. And here we are today. So that's as much as I can say for a background.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right.
So everyone, if you have questions or thoughts to Warren, just ask underneath this video. So today we wanted to have a conversation. We haven't really rehearsed this, and by the way, me and Warren don't always agree on everything online. So this will be interesting as ever. Warren has set up 10 lessons, 10 key takeaways that we can take from the coronavirus and how we can apply it in our day-to-day work, risk management. So this is going to be exciting, interesting. Stay with us and learn from this and contribute to the overall discussion by writing in the comments. Warren, please set us up with for the conversation, and then let's dive into the 10 lessons that you've picked up from the coronavirus.
All right, so let's set the context to some extent and have a look at our current reality. The year 2020 has been a very turbulent year for everybody at government level, corporate level, personal level. And, the coronavirus has been a phenomena that has just hit us in ways we could not possibly have begun to imagine in terms of, complex, highly dynamic risks. We always suspected certain aspects of it, but the coronavirus is basically the first time in our generation we've actually seen what it all means. And as you can see in that left-hand box, the impacts to us have been at a level we weren't really prepared for. And one of the forums that I've been following is the World Economic Forum, who followed this quite closely and written a lot of papers on what this all means. And basically what they've said is we were unprepared for this. We knew it was coming. We always knew it was coming, but we were unprepared. And it's now hit us in ways that we are going to have to deal with this in the long term. And the line that I really like from some of their more recent risk thinking is that the coronavirus will now dominate all our collective risk perceptions for decades to come. And what they said is pretty much every risk conversation we have for the next few decades will include the word coronavirus and how it's impacted. It's been that consequential to us. Now, I just want to say right up front that I understand that this is an incredibly emotive and divisive topic. And I know from personal experience that the more you talk about it, the more likely you are to trip over someone's personal levels of sensitivity. And I want to avoid that. We need to understand that this is the most magnificent phenomena we have experienced in our generation. It has impacted us all at personal, societal, and species level. Therefore, it's not only our right to question this, it's actually our duty. Because how we deal with this, what we learn from this is not just going to impact our generation, but future generations to come. So we have to get over any sensitivity about talking about it, about arguing about it, about questioning. And let's just look at it with the rational lens. And that's what I'm hoping we can do today. So the 10 lessons I have are very rational, well thought out academic arguments. And I just want to present them to the risk community and let the people decide for themselves what they actually mean. So let's get into it and have a look at what we're learning from the coronavirus. So the thing that I absolutely love about it, as tragic as it has been, it's been a wonderful lessons learned so far for the risk community, and particularly in terms of what the future of risk management looks like. And this is something I've been talking about at numerous conferences for years, but this year we got to see it in action. Already we've seen that the coronavirus has demonstrated that modern risk management is not a simple state game. It's a highly technical discipline that requires a valid understanding of such complex concepts as disruption, uncertainty management, probabilistic modeling, data analytics, complexity management, natural systemic resilience, and complex systems theory. And every one of those bullets is a key requirement of the future risk manager. And coronavirus has proven that over and over again. And I know a lot of those are close to your heart, Alex, but you know, if you've read the press, if you watch the papers, watch the TV articles, you're seeing it unfold in real time. So the lesson for the risk management community, if you want a job this time, 5 years, 10 years from now in this discipline, these bullet point areas are where you're going to have to upskill and become a pro. And I know you got some views on it, so I welcome you to throw in a comment about where you see the future of risk management going and what we've learned from coronavirus in this respect.
Yeah. I mean, I totally agree. There's a lot of prerequisite kind of mathematical appreciation that Corona brought to the forefront. I mean, for the kind of the first one and the funniest one. Remember how out of every TV we heard about flattening the curve? And how many curves? I mean, you have one example on the right here. Remember how many curves we started seeing? I mean, literally every newsletter outlet, every organization has started forecasting the number of cases, number of deaths, etc. And what I found amazing is that most of those curves, for example, this on the right, this looks like a curve that we would use in probabilistic risk management and probability modeling, but it's not. It's actually just a graphical representation of a deterministic scenario, which is one scenario. So if anything, most of the forecasts, I mean, there were amazing forecasts, and during the Risk Awareness Week, we will have Doug Hubbard talk about one, proper scientific way of forecasting Corona. We will have Sam Savage talk about one proper mathematical way to forecast new cases and so on. But most of the curves, they're just pure examples on how you can make something look like a proper risk analysis, but it actually never is. It's just a scenario as it all kind of this very limited way of representing information.
And one of the funny things to add on to that is, how many times have you seen a senior leader, a politician, whatever it is, stand up and show a mathematical distribution and claim to be an expert, and you come to realize that they really don't really understand what they're talking about. And this again is reiterating how serious risk management is in the modern generation, and how unskilled the vast majority of people who claim to be risk managers or have to risk management understanding are. So I think coronavirus has been a fantastic case example so far, and it's really highlighting what the future skills of the future risk manager is going to be.
Yeah.
So let's get into it, and let's have a look at a couple of the lessons, and hopefully people can decide for themselves and relate to it.
The only last kind of skill that I would add to your list is it's all about neuroscience, behavioral economics.
Fair enough.
It's kind of appreciation for how people perceive uncertainty and how people make choices under uncertainty. That also appears to be quite a significant skill set.
I agree, and that's a growing field. The behavioral side of decision making, the psychological side of it. So yeah, good on you. That's one I never thought of, but you're quite right. So if we look at some of the lessons, if we get into the lessons and the bulk of the purpose that we had today. So I think the most obvious lesson that came out of it, and one of the ones we learned quite early on, is that failing to plan for threats that are both foreseeable and inevitable have catastrophic consequences. So early on, people were talking about this as a black swan, but it was never a black swan. This was foreseeable. It was known. There were years of institutional warnings. The World Economic Forum had reported for 15 years in a row that one of the top 10 global macro risks was the risk of a global pandemic. The World Health Organization, the IMF, numerous people were reporting on this as being a potential risk. We also had numerous dry runs, swine flu, COVID's 1 to 19, Spanish flu. I mean, even go back as far as the Black Plague. There were numerous case examples, dry runs, and near misses.
The name, COVID-19. I think the clue is in the name.
So the point was, this wasn't a surprise. We always saw it coming, and when it came, we were unprepared. And when it did arrive, the only response we had was to place billions of people under house arrest, destabilize our global economy, and put our children's future at risk. And often people have asked me, how do we know our governments were unprepared for this? How do we know that society was unprepared for something this inevitable? Well, it's simple as this. And I always say this. If you want any thought as to whether our governments were prepared or not, consider this. No elected government in the world would have ever pre-approved a pandemic response plan that included putting millions of tax-paying citizens and voters under house arrest and shutting down all of the nation's financial ecosystem. The fact that was our response is the ultimate indicator we were not prepared, because nobody would have ever accepted that as a plan leading up to this. So I think this is an obvious one. It had catastrophic consequences. And the scary thing is, it's not just coronavirus. There are so many other macro global threats out of there, water crises, rising poverty, climate change, you name it, that we know are coming and we're unprepared. So I think this is the biggest lesson, or the most obvious one, that if we know a risk, if it's foreseeable, if it's inevitable, we have to have a plan. There's no excuse.
And I've had this, ironically, I had this conversation with my wife. And early on in the corona, and it became apparent that the global risks, I guess an average human assumes that the government or some sort of agency would take care of thinking and mitigating and preparing for that risk. But then on the other kind of side of the scale, so you have those macro risks, and you expect governments to think about them. But then on the other side of the scale, I mean, I'm sure you have as well. I mean, we worked with government agencies a lot. They're not really famous for their amazing risk management skills. I mean, I worked with Australian governments at all levels back in the day, and Australian government is one of the better ones in the world. And my God, their risk management was embarrassing. So it's not kind of surprising that it's surprising how much trust we're placing in organizations that are not really designed or fit to deal with those kind of crises. So the conversation I was having with my wife is that we really shouldn't kind of wait and see what the government decision makers choose as the response, because there is very little probability that their response would be an optimal one. So we have to make our own choices, and we have to make our own decisions, and think about protecting our own family, and figure out kind of our way, our own solutions.
Yeah, look, the unfortunate reality is that every elected government in the world tends to focus on the here and now, things that are of particular concern right now, because they're always in between a voting cycle. So, and it's not just the governments, it's also our senior institutions, the organizations that we work for. We seem to have an inherent trust that the people we report to are looking after our shoulders. And I think we have to learn that, it's not always like that. We have a personal obligation to participate in this as well. And I think people are starting to get that we can't trust our major institutions, not just governments, it's all our major institutions. We can't trust them to look after ourselves alone. We have to participate. We have to shape the conversations ourselves. So let's move on, because the next one I think is very similar and it builds onto this. So the next lesson that we have here is that once we identified a threat, we can't just wait until it escalates into crisis, because this only results in a need for more extreme responses. So we found ourselves in a position in roughly January, February that we knew this was coming. All right. I know you and I were talking quite early on about, which risks do we prioritize over, COVID at the time. I was traveling in January, I was traveling through Southern Africa, and even then they were talking about potential border shutdowns, and they were taking screening tests at borders. So we knew it was coming in January. In late January, we knew this was happening. We should have then been using our time to plan, and that means procuring face masks, stocking up on sanitizer, building ventilators, preparing hospitals, changing behaviors, you name it. There were a lot of things we could have been doing in January, February, early March to avoid lockdown, but we didn't. We watched, we waited, and we left it too late, and then we had no choice but to lock down. So the reason we locked down in late March, April, was because we'd left it too late and we had no other choice. And that set off a chain of events that were absolutely catastrophic. Global economic meltdown, record unemployment, record failures, record deaths. All of this could have been prevented if, when we recognized the risk in late December, January, we started planning that, but we didn't. So we knew this risk was coming, we saw it emerging, and we did nothing about it until it was too late. And that is probably the second learning here, is that waiting until it escalates into crisis is unacceptable. When we know the risk is coming, we've got to start planning early on.
I agree with you, with the caveat that I'd probably be a little bit more careful with the words the early preparation could have changed, because we just never know what all of the
absolutely
consequences.
And that's fair enough. There's no way to know for certain, but what we can say is doing nothing certainly didn't help. All right,
absolutely.
It never gave us the option.
The benefit of hindsight tells us that exactly our kind of ignorance response didn't really help much. So that definitely wasn't the optimal choice. But on this point overall, so we agree on this, but this point is probably the most important one in my eyes, because in reality, forecasting and predicting certain things is hard. However, even if we didn't, for some reason, realize pandemic was real enough to care about, even if we didn't prepare 2 years ago, pandemic response plan for our corporations. When things started unfolding, that's what risk management is about. It's about seeing the different signals and reacting quicker than
responding. Yep, absolutely.
And I've had this conversation with my CEO back, I think, in February or January, and I learned my lesson. I wish we did. I wish we did more, because he was literally asking, like, coronavirus. What are your thoughts? And I said, our Chinese ports will be affected, and we have to think about logistics. But he said, that's not it. It's much bigger than that. You need to think wider. And he was absolutely right. It was the signals that I undervalued and underutilized, and then we could have responded even quicker.
And I know you've read some of my stuff on complexity theory. Signals is a big one in risk management. In January, February, all the signals were pointing towards this is going to escalate. We need to prepare for it. And we failed to pay attention to the signal. And that's a huge part of complex risk management. If you ignore the signals, well, you just get caught out. So moving on, let's get on to lesson number 3, because we've got quite a few to go. This is one that I found particularly interesting. I presented it a couple of times to very different results and audiences. But it's the big question of how did we come to prioritize one particular macro threat above all the others? I mean, what was it specifically about COVID-19 that made us shut down the world? And there's a number of ways of looking at it, but what you see on the screen is a graph which has become highly contentious. And I just want to point out straight away that this is just an indicator. It's for conversation purposes. If you want, there's no genuine scientific validity behind it. I haven't done any metric testing or anything. But if you want to read up on this, there are numerous articles looking at how COVID relates to other threats out there. And I've provided a link to a World Economic Forum report if you want to look into some of the more academic detail. But what this basically says is that COVID was never the most fatalistic risk that the world is facing, nor was it ever the most disruptive. I mean, when it comes to fatal risk, heart disease is probably the most fatal risk in the world right now. It kills roughly 50,000 people a day, every day in perpetuity. COVID's never emulated that, all right? And when it comes to disruptive risk, climate change, global water shortages, poverty, biodiversity have significantly more potential for global disruption. So again, COVID was never up there. Now, it's a matter of debate where it sits neatly, but it's the point. It was never the most fatalistic nor the most disruptive. Yet for some reason, that is the one that we decided was completely unacceptable. We set our risk appetite that all COVID deaths are preventable and unacceptable. Therefore, we will shut down the world to protect these lives. And this has become highly contentious. And I think it's the one point that is going to create the most debate and further research. How do we prioritize one macro threat over all the others? I know that in March, it was highly uncertain. We didn't know it could explode. It could kill billions of people. There was so much uncertainty around, and that seems to be the biggest driver. Things like heart disease, we know has a very uniform profile. We know how many people it will kill day on day. There was just so much uncertainty that we didn't know, and we couldn't risk it escalating and blowing out of control. But you know what? The funny thing is now, in the month of September, we know its profile. We know where it sits. We know how many people it kills. We know it's nowhere near poverty, which kills 80,000 people a day, or heart disease or cancer, or even malaria or HIV. But yet, for those other risks, we're not putting the same investment or the same risk. And this has become highly contentious. Why is COVID so much more special than all those other risks out there, which are killing people on a day-to-day basis? And nobody has ever been able to explain this with any level of, ethical, convincing argument around it. And it just seems to be that the world picked this one risk and made it its special case, and we've gone ballistic around it. And I don't know how else to explain it. It's highly contentious. Everybody has their views, and I welcome your view on this.
Well, I kind of want to bring, I'm not sure I really do have a view on COVID specifically because it's such a complex issue, but I do want to bring it back to the corporate world. It's a little kind of, it's a common behavior that we have when something comes to mind and there's kind of risk on the agenda of the board or the audit committee or the executives. And then suddenly everything else kind of fades into the darkness and everyone is kind of spotlighting on a specific risk, dropping the ball on all the other risks that probably have much higher potential to cause volatility of financial performance, which is absolutely weird to me. Risk management is not one risk at a time game. It's about managing all the effects of all of those risks combined on the decisions and the objectives. So this is super weird. But one argument for kind of spotlighting COVID specifically, this is what Nassim Taleb calls extremistan versus mediocristan, where certain risk behaviors, the speed of spread and the impact has much greater potential, negative potential than others. For example, with heart disease, there's a stable projection. With coronavirus, it could be exponential.
It's very volatile, yeah.
If not dealt with properly. So there are some arguments for why not all risks are equal. But I do agree. This lesson is more about the general conclusion that, and you could see it because the climate change activists, they literally dropped off the face of the earth for a few months
Yeah.
while the corona was in the active stage.
Yeah.
I just thought it was quite peculiar.
And one of the things I've said regularly about this is that somewhere along the line, whether it's this year or next year or whatever, coronavirus will die down, as every other virus has. And then climate change will come front to the agenda again. So who's going to tell Greta Thunberg that, no, we're not going to shut down the world and invest in climate change the same way as we did coronavirus? Because reality is climate change has significantly more potential. It's coming. It's inevitable. It's foreseeable. It has significantly more potential to kill people and disrupt the planet. So how do we now justify we're not going to do the same for climate change as we did for coronavirus? So it's a very crazy, mixed up world. I don't have all the answers, but I present this as a lesson learned. You cannot prioritize one risk and ignore everything else. It just creates longer term exposure. And I think that's one of the lessons that we have here. Right. So moving on to lesson number 4. This is one I know you and I have had a couple of conversations off. So the lesson here is around fat tail risk. So for those who don't know, fat tail is an emerging threat with a high probability of an extreme outcome. So in March, there was a severe concern that this was going to be a fat tail risk. It could create uncontrollable amounts of damage and death. And that's why we rushed into lockdowns quite quickly. At around about the same time, a number of seminal risk experts around the world, people like Ben Flyberg, N.N. Taleb, they were submitting papers, institutional papers to government and stuff, and saying there's a case for shutting down everything, and it became known as cutting off the tail. And the argument was we have to go all in to cut off the tail. In other words, forego all traditional cost-benefit analysis or all rational decision-making. If we don't react to this quickly and cut off the tail, we could lose control of this and it could just blow out and billions of people would die. And that was the concern in March. So the argument became that we have to go all in, throw everything at it and cut off the tail, which is a fine theoretical argument. But what we also learned was as soon as we did that, it created numerous other fat tail risks: a global economic crisis, record unemployment, record poverty, record business failure. So now what do we do to cutting off the tail? And what we learned is that if we're going to go all in to cut off the tail, we have to be convinced that we will cut the tail quickly. And if we look at the curve that we've seen there, we saw the flattening of the curve argument. Almost every discussion we had on flattening of the curve was that we would cut it off and it would be done. We would flatten the curve out, we would deal with it, the tail would be cut and there and done and dusted. But it never. The tail just grew. More fat tails came along, and we then didn't have an answer for what happens when we cannot cut the tail off. And we're now living the legacy of this tail has just grown. And now we live in a world where not only do we have to deal with coronavirus, but at the same time, we also have to deal with a record economic fallout, global unemployment, and all the other things that go with it. So multiple other fat tails. So that's one of my observations. And I know you're a proponent of fat tail theory, so I'd love to hear your views on that.
Well, I wanted to take this point because, I mean, I agree with this point. I want to take it in a slightly different direction because I think the kind of the interesting observation lies in the behavioral science on this point is that it may well look on paper how we can cut off the tail by restricting, movement and limiting human behavior, but then there are 7 billion individuals who all, and that's a complex system if there ever was one. Yep. Each person with their own motivations, own stories, and their own kind of behavioral patterns. So, lockdowns sounds good in principle, but then every country has protests, group activities, and the police are really kind of having to kind of turn into a military state. I mean, even Australia, which is so weird. And in fact, it's so weird that all my Australian friends are really freaking out because they have never experienced something that was normal in Spain. I mean, we had exactly the same lockdowns, exactly the same policing in Spain. And that was like no big deal because that's what you would expect from Spanish police. Or the same in Russia. Like you would expect much more tough measures from Russian police on a normal day than a coronavirus day. But then Australians are, like, specifically in Victoria, they're really, really freaking out because to them this is kind of unheard of.
Unheard of. We've never seen this level of restriction before. So I'm just thinking for purpose of time, it might be timing to move on to the next point because it goes very much to that same kind kind of idea. So what we then learned was that as soon as you shift the dynamics of a complex system, as you talked, a complex societal system, we see emergence. And this is probably one of the key learnings of all complex systems theory, that as soon as you shift the parameters of a complex system, new behaviors and risks and phenomena will emerge. And we saw almost instantaneously that once we shut down, new emergent risks came up, poverty, homelessness, depression, and there's a whole raft of them that we now have to deal with. So we didn't just cut off the tail or deal with coronavirus. A whole bunch of other monumental risks then emerge. And this is a classic example of how when you shift the parameters of a complex system, new behaviors and threats and opportunities will emerge out of it. So here we find ourselves in a position where we're now not just dealing with coronavirus, we're dealing with the fallout of coronavirus, and that is emergence. So we're in a bit of a hole, if you ask me personally, and it's going to take a lot of intelligent responsiveness to get out of it, but only time will tell. So our response hasn't been the greatest. If people ask me, do I think we responded well? I say, just look at all the emergent risks that came out of our responses, then answer that for yourself. So your views?
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, this is one of the biggest lessons is whenever you shift something in one side in the complex system, 10 other things pop up, and it's equally important for us in business. When we're trying to respond to supply chain risks, we have to be mindful of liquidity, which is, by the way, this is, speaking of the good lessons, this was the big takeaway, which it took me a while of convincing, but then it worked out really well because our initial, as a corporation, our initial response was all about people, protecting safety, protecting workforce, protecting the relatives, keeping the plants operational because they cannot stop, keeping the local communities safe. That was the initial response, just like everybody else. And what I kept pushing from the very, very beginning of our kind of official, corporate response is that coronavirus impact is at least supply chain and logistics, revenue, market prices, and demand, and our customer behavior, liquidity and payment discipline, and cash flow and financial additional financing from the banks to cover the liquidity, and of course the human side. There are at least 4 separate elements which are very interconnected. And I was very kind of glad when everybody realized that this, in fact, is a complex problem. So we started, instead of having a response group responsible for for just the human side, we had the response group which talked through every single day on the morning call, talk through all of the 4 areas. What's happening with the supply chain? What's happening with our logistics? What's happening with our customers, the demand and the market prices? What's happening with our liquidity, cash flow forecasting? We were reforecasting our cash flows every week just to test and stress test different assumptions and stress test different scenarios and price market. And of course, talk about the employees, the families, the local communities where we operate.
And that's a great way to go about it. So I think the key learning here for the risk management community is that when we work in complex environments, if we shift one part of the complex situation, other areas are going to react. And that's probably a key learning for modern day risk management. So moving on to the next lesson, one that has been around for a while, but it became very popular during the coronavirus, the concept of wicked problems. And the lesson here is wicked problems don't just give up in the first round. So for those who don't know, wicked is a particular state of resistance. It denotes a state of continued resistance to resolution. So every time you try and address a problem, it just shifts and manifests in a different form. It's got a little bit to do with emergence and the butterfly effect, but it's ultimately a threat or a challenge that will not be resolved easily. And pandemics are a fantastic example of it. So I've got 2 graphs on the screen where we look at the profile of the 1918 Spanish flu, and I've compared it to the Australian profile, and you'll see that they are comparably close, which kind of suggests that although we're starting to get on top of our second wave here in Australia, there may very well be a third wave. And those waves are very good examples of wicked risks manifesting in different shapes. So one of the learnings here is that, wicked problems don't give up easily. And here in Australia and New Zealand, there was a sense of arrogance about 2 months ago that we've controlled this. The world, we were telling ourselves that the world are looking at us in jealousy because we've contained the coronavirus. And I just remember shaking my head and saying, how can people say that? Every major pandemic comes in waves. It's a wicked problem. There were politicians both in New Zealand and in Australia standing up saying we've contained the coronavirus. One in New Zealand even said we've eliminated the coronavirus. Now look where we are. All right. Both are having severe second waves. So wicked problems don't give up in the first round. So we have to understand that wicked challenges will go back, regroup, change, and come back at you in a different format. So you can't just make the assumption that because we've got over the hurdle the first time, that it's not going to come back in a different format. And I think that's a key lesson for complex risk management in the new generation.
I totally agree. And it is kind of sad to observe that most of the conversations were really happening in the paradigm of let's get over it and this will be it. Like not many conversations about coronavirus at the corporate level have been at the kind of phrased as we have to get over the first hurdle and then get ready if there was a second or third or fourth. It was really binary. We need to get through this and that's it.
There was a lot of linear thinking. We're going to cut off the tail. It's done. It's dusted. It's solved. Everybody declare victory. And I just looked at that and I remember shaking my head.
Totally agree.
But this leads on to the next one, which is possibly why this happened. So lesson number 7 is all about variety. The key to controlling complex phenomena is having variety and control. So in complex systems theory, the concept that explains this best is what's known as Ashby's law of requisite variety. And basically what it says is that a complex problem will throw multiple variations of the problem at you. And therefore, if you want to control it, you have to have multiple variations of a control. In other words, any solution you put on the table must be able to address as many variations of the problem as are thrown at you. And there's a good screen that shows you what happens when we have vulnerability in our control responses. And this has been a very interesting one because right from the beginning, when the whole world chose to accept lockdowns as their go-to control, I remember saying to people, there's not enough variety in that. If everybody does the same thing, we're not aware of whether that is the best way to do it or whether there are other methods of doing it. We've all rushed in with the same response. And I remember there were differing views of that. But Ashby's law says that a wicked problem is going to change. Therefore, we have to have a plan B, a plan C. So what I would have liked to have seen is when we went through the initial round of lockdown, we started looking at what the next version of the control is. And we simply refused to do it. We refused to look at any other possibility than just lockdown. And this has now caught us out because when the second wave came, all we knew to do was throw lockdowns at it yet again. And a lot of people were saying we need to be looking at variations from lockdown. The Swedish model became very sensitive. We weren't allowed to talk about it. They got branded as the villains because they chose to do something different. And all the time I was saying we need someone to do something different. We need variety in our control responses so that we can identify what works and doesn't what works. I was a big proponent for Sweden doing something different because the world actually needed that. And at the time, they were seen as supervillains. But look where they are now. As we stand, Sweden has one of the lowest new infection rates in the world. In fact, if you go look at the scoreboard, not that I like using deaths as a scorecard, but that's what we seem to be doing in the press. If you go look at the scorecard, Sweden has had one of the lowest new death rates and new infection rate in the world in recent times. In fact, they're even doing better than Australia and New Zealand right now in that regard. So all of a sudden, variety is being accepted. And I've seen that the press and political messages have shifted, and people are now starting to say we need to try something different, which is what I've been saying all along. If you have multiple control options, you can determine for yourself which is the best one and hone in on that. We were never prepared to accept any form of variety beyond just lockdown, and that has caught us out. And I see that as a problem in future risk management.
And it's a lesson that we can apply in our day-to-day lives, kind of beyond Corona as well. It's having plan B, C, D, E, and always trying to achieve the objective with kind of multiple possible possible solutions. I mean, to me, the kind of the historical, the common complex problem was culture, risk culture. Getting people, because risk management is a decision-making tool. So the ultimate goal is to help people think about risks before they make an important decision. Now, that is not very easy to do by the risk management department itself, because I, for example, cannot be personally involved in every single decision in the company. I mean, that's just physically impossible. And so I get involved in some of the big strategic decisions or investment decisions, or budgeting or hedging decisions. But then there are a million other decisions that I cannot get involved in. So I have to kind of bring this awareness and culture to people, so they start thinking about risks and they don't rely on the intuition and system one thinking, and they don't fail to see or properly mitigate the risks when they make decisions. And I always, to myself and in my articles, I always call risk culture as or integrating risk thinking into the overall corporate culture. I'm not really that fast on the actual term, but I was always kind of going for I called it million drops in the brain. Is you have to have multiple small things because you never know which one will work, and
which one's going to land.
It's kind of the same with responses. You have to have multiple things because, truth be told, we really don't know which one will work best, nor can we tell until actual risks happen.
And on that note, I always felt uncomfortable when they kept telling us that global experts have told us that lockdowns are the way to go. So just accept it. And it's like, no, all we've done is decided to listen to one set of experts and ignore everybody else, all the other experts, all right? So if we all do the same thing, how can we possibly say that this is the best control? We don't know. We've got nothing to compare it to, all right? So moving on to lesson 8. So we're making some progress. This is a key one that came out of the coronavirus battle. It's the concept of the law of regression to the tail. And what it says is that some risks will only keep getting more and more extreme. So there's a really good academic paper out there by Ben Flyberg. I provide a reference for people who want to look up. But basically what he said, and others, is that certain risks such as pandemics, market crashes, mega project failures, natural disasters and the like, they're only getting more and more intense and more fatalistic every generation. So if we cannot learn to deal with coronavirus right now, we're in deep trouble, because there's a good chance that in the next generation, next 2 generations, another virus will come along that's bigger, more nasty, more fatalistic, because that is the direction that regression to the tail goes. As our world gets more populous and more connected and more intense, the impact of global pandemics will just get bigger and nastier. So don't fool yourself by thinking, oh, we made a mistake or we didn't get coronavirus right, but at least it's now over. No, these risks are going to keep coming back at us bigger and better. So there are just certain classes of risks that get bigger and more fatalistic every generation. So our controls have to get better every single time. So we cannot fall into the trap that, there was a big one, so the next one will be smaller. No, the next one could be twice as big.
Yeah. And that's interesting. I mean, it looks like it could be true for the big risks that you mentioned. But even for day-to-day life, like day-to-day corporate life, regression to the mean is kind of the common way of modeling risks. You have a certain expected historical value, and then you just kind of model volatility around it. And that's the technique that most companies use in forecasting, budgeted risk, cash flow at risk, and all of the common things we do at work. And what we are observing right now in our company, for example, is that for quite a period of time, we don't really show that regression back to the mean. We're staying at the bottom, and we're beginning to, when we try to apply just historical volatility, it doesn't do the job anymore, because the historical picture is much more rosy and prettier than what we have been observing for the last few years. And if we just plug in this kind of assumption of everything will come back to normal, that will show a much more optimistic and maybe unsupportedly optimistic or overly optimistic picture than the reality. and we will just we will make wrong decisions based on this because it has much more upside than the reality shows. So it may be true that many things, not just big risks, kind of tend to regress to the tail more than to the middle.
So one of the things I thought was interesting is we just look at coronavirus specifically. There's an assumption that we'll have a couple of waves and eventually it'll die out. That may not even be true. We've already seen that the second wave was bigger here in Australia. We may have a third bigger wave, a fourth bigger wave, and that's what regression to the tail is. We may have multiple waves and every one of them gets bigger. It doesn't average out and die down. So we may have a couple more waves that are even more fatalistic than this. We simply don't know. But we cannot fall into the trap of assuming it will die out and go back to some sort of norm. And that's the key learning here for many of these risks. So moving on to the last two risks. The next one is the one close to my heart. I have a particular passion for modern day resilience and using natural systems theory to build in resilience. So conventional views of resilience tend to promote the concept of bouncing back. Whenever we have a disaster or a failure, let's bounce back. And if we can bounce back to our business as usual state, we're a resilient organization. We've seen a lot of commentary in the political era and in the press saying after coronavirus, we need to bounce back. We need to bounce back. That's completely the wrong way of looking at it. We don't want to bounce back to a business as usual state because our business as usual was actually a state of pre-existing vulnerability. The reason that coronavirus hit us so hard is because we lived in a vulnerable state of existence. So we definitely don't want to bounce back to that. What we need to do is bounce forward to a new state of higher resilience. And this is one of the things that's coming out of new modern day resilience theory, particularly in the age of perpetual disruption, is that the more disruptive our world becomes, the more resilience has to be about bouncing forward, bouncing to a new, more resilient state rather than bouncing back to a previous state of vulnerability. So I am personally of the view that we're going to see a lot of our business continuity and disaster recovery books starting to be rewritten to not talk about bouncing back to business as usual, but bouncing forward to a better, more resilient state. So bouncing back is not an intelligent solution in the age of perpetual disruption, nor coronavirus. Bouncing forward to a more resilient state is what we desire. So I think that's our ninth lesson, if you will.
Yeah, and I totally agree. And I mean, this one is probably the easiest one to understand and appreciate for all of our listeners. Because, I mean, what did Corona teach us? Working from home, technology, communications, and most of it is fine. We're like, surprise, we could actually do it.
Yeah, who knew?
Working from home for many people, I mean, me included, worked amazingly. I mean, it was just the greatest period of working from home, and so this opens up so many opportunities that it would be ridiculous to ignore them and just kind of pretend we have to force ourselves into that old state. So coronavirus has opened up a lot of amazing opportunities for business, new ways of communicating, new ways of doing business, new ways of doing traditional things that just never really required that much personal contact face to face.
And kudos to you, because you've said right from the beginning in some of our earlier conversations is that we're fixating on the negative sides of this, but very few of us are actually looking at the opportunities and the opportunities to evolve, which brings us to the final lesson, which to me is probably the most important one. And that is, from chaos springs new life. And what I'm talking specifically about is the Great Reset campaign. So there's a link to it. The World Economic Forum has introduced this campaign, which I think is a phenomenal campaign. And it's about what life needs to look like after coronavirus, how we take the lessons of coronavirus and bounce forward to a new, more resilient state. And their argument, and complex systems theory argument, says that it normally takes some form of chaos to shift everything so that they adapt and move to a new state. People very rarely change because they decide they want to. Most people change because they have to, because the system has shifted and it's not like it used to be. So if we look at some of the great catastrophic disruptions of our planetary existence, great asteroid, Black Plague, Dark Ages, the Great Depression, and even World War II, in the decades that immediately followed after that, we had some of our most innovative and entrepreneurial years. The innovation and new thinking and new ways of working that came out of those great chaotic periods actually set us up for the next few generations of our existence. So as catastrophic and as terrible as the coronavirus has been, look to the opportunities. This is our opportunity to get rid of a lot of the vulnerabilities and the inefficiencies in our society that we've accepted. It's our opportunity to reset and start anew on a higher plane. And the reason it is critically important was because this need was growing even before coronavirus came along. The whole concept of Industry 4.0, the digital age, was requiring us to upskill and shift, and we simply weren't doing it. And all that coronavirus has done is come along and accelerated our understanding of how unprepared we are, and maybe, just maybe, this will be the catalyst to get us to all change, to upskill, to rethink, to reset. And if I can leave everybody with one thing from this, is that stop reading a lot of the conventional risk theory that's out there, the old thinking. Start reading up on the Great Reset. Start looking at the academic papers and lessons learned coming out of the Great Reset, because that gives us a glimpse of what the future needs to look like if we want to survive in the new modern world.
I totally agree. There are so, on the back of a lot of the kind of the negativity around coronavirus and the consequences that hit a lot of families. I mean, the number is quite big. On the back of it, there are a lot of quite amazing, once a decade opportunities. And I remember I was in Australia in 2008 when the global financial crisis hit, and I was working as a consultant and I was broke. And as a junior consultant, and I was broke, and I saw the crisis kind of come along and just pass, and I couldn't do anything about it because every crisis is once a decade opportunity to create learning, to create wealth. It's one of those kind of shortcuts or cheat sheets that are happening in life that allow you to kind of jump up significantly. And I certainly took full advantage of this crisis in every possible way that I always wanted, but never had an opportunity. So a crisis is always opens up amazing opportunities, but it does take a certain skill set to kind of stop paying attention to just negative things. Yes, protect your family, yes, protect your loved ones as the first priority, but then start focusing on all the different opportunities that are just floating by. And how can you, sort out your pension retirement savings, for example. That's something a lot of good risk managers did during the coronavirus, because the opportunities were literally once a decade. I mean, I'm saying once a decade because it was kind of 9 years since the last one, but I'm hoping it will be another decade until the next one, and not sometimes sooner.
Give us some time to catch our breath and reset. Look, I'm just conscious of time, but so it's probably a good time to get onto the closing slide. I've got a little cartoon here that I found, which I absolutely love. I've run a blog and a whole series of thought papers during the time of the coronavirus, and the reason that I've been pushing these thought processes, because I really believe we as a risk management community need to rethink the way we approach these kind of risks. And for me, it was never just about COVID-19. It was, I got some criticism from people that I'm not an expert in viruses nor COVID-19. And I agree, I'm not. But I'm looking at it from the point of view that it's not just this risk. We're now living in a world where these risks are going to become more and more frequent. Now it's COVID-19. But next, 5 years, it's going to be the recession. The years after that, we're going to have to deal with climate change. The years after that, we're going to have to deal with diversity collapse. So these these macro global threats are getting more and more frequent, and it means we've got to up our game in terms of how we approach these risks. So COVID was one particular case, but we have to take the learnings and build on them. So we cannot just ignore it. We cannot just accept it. And the question I like to ask people, to bring it all home is, have we learned anything from this coronavirus experience that will allow us to rebuild and get to that higher level of proficiency we desire? Because the reality is, how we planned for and responded to the coronavirus is critically indicative of how we will inevitably plan for and respond to all those future macro global threats. And we really need to think about that. So think about that for a while, and regardless of what your personal opinion are of my thoughts or Alex's thoughts or anybody else, ask yourself honestly, are you happy with how we dealt with COVID-19? Because how we dealt with COVID-19 is almost certainly indicative of how we're going to deal with the recession, climate change, and every other macro threat that comes along. And if you're happy with that, well, then that's fine. But if you're not happy with it, what are you going to do about it? And that's where I come from. I'm trying to do something about it by highlighting it, escalating it, asking questions, and even offering potential solution. I don't claim I'm getting it right all the time, but at least I'm trying. And I'm encouraging you all to do the same.
And I wanted to thank you very much for those thoughts. And I wanted to kind of to build a bridge with the other sessions and the overall theme of the Risk Awareness Week. Because there's, in this weird world, we have risk management 1, which we call traditional risk management, but it never really has been traditional risk management because it's only 40 years old, or 30-something years old, compared to real traditional risk management, probability theory and decision science and neuroscience, which are somewhere between 100 and 500 years old. But we call it risk management 2. And this conference is all about the scientific methods that have been helping humans to deal with uncertainty for years. So if anything, our industry was closely related to food, so it was quickly recognized as a strategic industry. So it fared better than many other industries in the world during the coronavirus. But I was quite impressed with our corporate response and the techniques that we used, game theory, stress testing assumptions, scenario planning, simulation, decision trees, all the scientific techniques that you wouldn't find in COSO ERM or ISO 31000 kind of explicitly mentioned. It is mentioned in 31010 a little bit, but all those kind of risk management 2 techniques that all the other speakers at the Risk Awareness Week will talk about, they were up to the task to a degree. There's more that we can put in for example, in our simulation models. There's more from complexity theory that needs to be adjusted. For example, one of the assumptions is regression to the mean, and that assumption may no longer hold true. So we do need to adjust our models, but our techniques of stress testing, simulating, scenario analysis, that helped a lot to improve better decision making. What was useless, and I hope everyone is realizing that, is having a corporate risk register or a heat map that, I'm guessing, gave your management absolutely nothing in their response to coronavirus. That didn't help you forecast how coronavirus and the upcoming recession and the change in consumer behavior will affect your cash flows or your liquidity, your covenants, and so on, how much extra funding your company will need to stay afloat. So one positive takeaway from this is coronavirus have once again highlighted that qualitative risk assessments that you do once a quarter are ridiculously stupid, and they do not do much value for your business. But then on the other hand, the mathematical techniques that have been around for hundreds of years and have been used in military research, operational research, have been used in going to space, they still work. They used to build bridges, buildings. They still equally apply to how we manage risk. So a lot of the other sessions during the Risk Awareness Week, they will kind of introduce you to the techniques that are old as time and still work fine.
All right. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you, Warren. Everyone, please ask questions underneath this video. If you found this session insightful, do share it with your colleagues at work, because risk awareness, after all, is all about just spreading the messages and helping people who may not be familiar with the kind of in-depth risk analysis techniques to learn about appreciating uncertainty, because this is what risk management is all about, after all. It's about giving people the ammunition and the techniques to appreciate uncertainty, account for uncertainty when making decisions, and therefore making better choices. And we have quite a variety of workshops. I mean, some of the sessions are using risk techniques to find a better way or the optimal way to get to an airport or buy a house. Or one of the sessions is quite funny, is how do you rob a bank using proper risk management? So there's a lot of life application, as well as solving quite complex mathematical business problems, multi-billion-dollar problems. But there are also applications of risk analysis in our day-to-day lives. So I thank you. I thank Warren for this session, and we'll see you in the next sessions during the Risk Awareness Week. Thank you. Write your comments underneath this video. Bye, everyone.